If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then everything, our faith, our trust, our hope, it collapses. Paul says it plainly in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. That's why having a strong understanding of the resurrection and why we believe in it, not just because the Bible tells us to or because we have blind faith, but because the most logical conclusion to all of the things we've been talking about over the past few weeks leads to the idea that the resurrection truly happened. Now, there are a lot of objections to the resurrection, things that skeptics throw out there, like maybe the disciples made it up and they lied about it. Maybe Jesus didn't really die, but he just kind of fainted and then came back, came to again. Maybe it was all metaphorical or spiritual is how the Bible meant it. So we're going to take a look at some of these objections in this final part of our series, our three-part series. So if you haven't listened to the evidence for the resurrection, those happened in the last two episodes, episode 13 and 14. And then in this episode, we're going to walk through the most common objections. We're going to look at the historical data around those objections and give you confident research supported answers so that we can come to a very good understanding of the truth of the resurrection and be prepared and equipped to talk to people who come up with these objections against the resurrection. So by the end of this episode, you're going to have a whole new level of confidence in your faith and know that it's not just blind faith, but logical conclusions based on an evidence-rooted trust in a God who truly overcame death. I'm thrilled you're here with us on the Christian Clinician, where we join faith with evidence-based medicine to revitalize your health and renew your faith. Get ready for real and informative conversations with wellness experts and Christian scholars alike to gain a deeper understanding of our faith, explore our God-given purpose, and discover how the strength of our relationship with God can impact our health here on earth. Welcome to another episode of The Christian Clinician. I'm your host, Dr. Tanya Paynter, and today we are finishing out the last of the 3-episode series on evidence for the resurrection. Today we're going to be covering the most common objections to the resurrection, including variations in the gospel accounts, the mass hallucination theory, the metaphorical resurrection or kind of the spiritual resurrection objection, the legend theory, the wrong tomb theory, the swoon theory, and the stolen body theory. So there are a lot of objections out there and different theories on how they can kind of explain away the resurrection in the empty tomb, which we went through some of the evidence for in the last couple of episodes. This was something that I really needed when I was going through my year of doubt in 2023, and I didn't have any of this evidence. I didn't have any of the answers to these objections, and so I kept returning to the question, what if I'm wrong? What if the resurrection didn't really happen, or I misunderstand what the Bible is actually trying to tell me? And so I didn't want, go back to the Bible and just read and pray about it. And I wanted facts. I wanted answers that could help satisfy the logical part of my brain. And so that forced me to do a very deep dive into the historical and theological research. And of course, then we did it even more during my master's program. And the deeper I went into this question, the stronger the evidence became and solidified beyond a doubt in my mind that the resurrection truly did happen. So let's take a look at the mass hallucination objection. So this argument proposes that the sightings of Jesus after his death were just mass hallucinations, and that he wasn't actually alive, but people just hallucinated that they saw him. The problem with this theory, though, is that research shows that while mass hallucinations can occur, they always occur with a fixed item, like a statue, and under shared conditions. So when the right conditions occur, it can make it appear supernatural. What mass hallucinations do not do is they do not occur with varied sightings at different locations by different people at different times. And so the resurrection appearances were reported by multiple people in different locations and situations, which contradicts the nature of mass hallucinations. That's what we see in the gospel, right? We see that the resurrection appearances were actually between large groups and individuals at different locations throughout the countryside, in different situations, inside a home, outside of a home, on the road, at different times of days, eating, walking through walls, all kinds of different things that happened, right? Nobody had the same type of experience with him. That is not something that we see with mass hallucinations.
So let's kind of go over some of the appearances, right? First, in Luke 24 and John 20, we have Jesus appearing to the 10 disciples who were hiding together the first day of the week. So, right after the empty tomb on that Monday. Then 8 days later, Jesus appeared to 11 disciples. So Mark 16, John 20. Jesus met up with two disciples on the road in Luke 24, and then he appeared to seven disciples in John 21. So this goes against anything that we know about mass hallucination, and the theory doesn't really hold much water. So it's really not actually accepted as a valid theory anymore. However, I have still heard it as an objection that there's still hallucination, and then sometimes they don't say that it's a mass hallucination. They just say that the individual disciples hallucinated, right? Because um, they were so in love with Jesus that sometimes when people die, then the loved ones will see them, down a hall or in the house or making tea or whatever they used to do, right? But again, we see that he didn't just appear to the disciples, right? He appeared to 500. He appeared to 500 people. Not, those 500 people probably knew him, but not intimately in the way that the disciples did. So, again, that theory is kind of debunked. So then there's the idea of the metaphorical resurrection. So this theory proposes that the resurrection was not literal of a physical body raising from the dead, but was more of a metaphor for the continuation of Jesus's teachings. And so we can rebut this by simply saying that the acceptance and belief of a physical resurrection happened very quickly after Jesus's death, and it indicates a literal interpretation. So we can point to the creed that Paul shared within a couple of years of Jesus's resurrection that was known throughout Rome and the countryside. And again, that's the 1 Corinthians 15 that I went into in the last two episodes, but it talked about his bodily resurrection. And so this indicates it affirms a physical resurrection and suggests that the understanding was not metaphorical in any sense, but was actually a literal resurrection of the physical body from the dead, and resulting in the empty tomb, which again we have evidence for the logical conclusion that the tomb was empty. It was definitely not a metaphor. So then we can move into objection number three, which is the resurrection developing as a myth. So this simply states that it was a mythological legend that developed over time. But again, this very quickly can be debunked by looking at the dating of the Gospels and the dating of the early Christian creeds. And so again, as we talked about in the last couple of episodes about 1 Corinthians 15, that the creed was basically an oral statement of shared belief that spread throughout the early believers. And so the early Christian creeds affirm the resurrection, and it appeared. So the one that is listed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, appeared within a couple of years of Jesus's death. And so again, the information about that creed is found in episode 13. So 2 episodes ago, we talked about this more in depth. But the first hint of this as becoming a foundational piece of the Christian faith is Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost. So Pentecost was 50 days after Passover, so less than 2 months. And you can find it in Acts chapter 2 to 22 through 36. And Peter declares the bodily resurrection of Christ in front of the crowd of witnesses. And all through early Acts, we have evidence of preaching the bodily resurrection. And then several years after the resurrection, when Paul traveled to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James, and we find this story in Galatians chapter 1, he would have learned this creed that Peter was sharing. And again, that ended up being 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, which reaffirms the resurrection as an actual occurrence. And so this all happened much too quickly for any kind of mythological development to happen. We know legends take several hundred years, not just several years. And then we also have eyewitness testimony. So we have the Gospels that were written anywhere between potentially the late 50s up to the 90s, right, in AD. And so that would indicate that there were still eyewitnesses, people who had lived during the time of Jesus, who wrote about it. And there were eyewitness testimonies, and they were dated much too early for a legend to have happened. And so that kind of brings us into a fourth objection, which is the variations in the resurrection narratives within the gospel make them all unbelievable. And so I hear this a lot, and it comes back to accepting gospel as historical documentation of, as evidence for the resurrection and for Jesus's life. And so when we look at talking to eyewitnesses and getting eyewitness accounts, and this comes back from my law enforcement days. When we would come on to a scene and we have to investigate what happened, we would isolate the different witnesses, and we would get everybody's statement. And that initial statement was really important because we would be able to tell based off of the differences in the statement how likely it was that they were telling us the truth and or who was making something up. And we could do this because we know that human nature, we all observe different things, right? Different focus points, based on past experiences that we have had as individuals. We hone in on different pieces of a scene. And so one person might really be into clothes and notice what the person was wearing, versus somebody else might have absolutely no idea and just try to fill in the blanks because they didn't pay attention to those details, right? And then we've got, well, one person was focused, they were across the street and they were looking across, and they were focused in on a bigger picture, versus someone who was within a fight, say. They could only see what was happening with the person or two people in front of them, right? And so you get different descriptions and different accounts of what happened based on where the person was, what part they experienced, what they observed, and the things that their brain particularly remembers. And so our brains do a great job of trying to fill in missing data to help us make sense of something that we've observed. So what we see is a bunch of different, small, different variations in the story. And that's when we know we've got people telling us the truth about what they observed happened. When we hear somebody sharing the exact same story, observed and told in the exact same way, we know, okay, everybody got together, they discussed what they were going to share, and now they're all sticking to the same story. And we know that everybody was lying, or that there's something not right about that situation. And then we have to dig deeper and get more in depth into that investigation to figure out, why do you guys all have the same story? Because this is not authentic. And so we see that same idea within the Gospels as well. They all agree on the core facts, right? They agree that Jesus, the tomb was empty. They agree the fact that Jesus was dead, that he rose again bodily, that he appeared to people in his resurrected body. And so all of those are the same. We have minor details about who saw, the tomb and how it happened, and all that kind of stuff. That's really very irrelevant to the main part of the story. The other thing that's really important to think about is we have to look at how history was documented back in 33 AD, right? We have to look at the literary uses, how people would document historical things. Who was the audience? Mark and Matthew and Luke and John. Some of them were writing to Gentile audiences who had no history of the Jewish nation, right? They didn't have any of the Old Testament and all that kind of stuff. They didn't know about any of that. Versus some of them that were writing specifically to a Jewish audience. And so they're going to pull out different aspects, or they're going to reframe how something might have happened in order to make a point. And that's not lying. It's not inaccurate. It is a choice in how they wrote the material and how they were choosing to present it and who they were presenting it to. And this all very much matters because we think about, oh, well, the Gospels are written like a newspaper, right? Only the facts and that's it. That's not how they documented things back then. They didn't write things like a facts only. They put their own understanding into the words that they wrote and how they were trying to show the importance of this. They showed the different aspects, right? John was very much about the Messiah and the spiritual piece that Jesus represents and who he was, from a divine standpoint. That was a huge focus for John. And so he's going to be looking at things a little bit differently and really wanting to focus in on and make different points about the story versus, Mark or Matthew or Luke, right? Luke was very much like a facts. I want to interview everybody that, saw things that happened and wanted to try to be as accurate as he could based off of what people were telling him. And so, Luke might be a more of a kind of newspaper reporting approach than John would be. And so we can't take how they chose to frame the story as a discrepancy because that's not in context of how that individual author would have written. Understanding that, different authors wrote to different audiences in different contexts and they did it in a different literary style than what we think of as historical documentation in the 20th century or 21st century. So that's all really important to keep in mind. And the fact that we want to see some minor variations. Otherwise, we're going to say, oh, well, they obviously just copied notes from each other, right? And that's not what we see happened. So these are all minor differences, and they all agree on the major themes, right? The major points of the story, which is Jesus's death, his resurrection, the empty tomb, his appearances to his followers. Okay, then we have the wrong tomb theory. So this theory suggests that the women and disciples went to the wrong tomb and found it empty. So I think this one's fairly easily argued against by simply saying that if that were the case, the Sanhedrin would have been more than happy to point out that they were at the wrong tomb, right? They would have pointed them to the correct tomb and say, "You guys, you're at the wrong tomb. Like he was buried over here." But when the guards went to the Sanhedrin in Matthew 28, the Sanhedrin didn't say go to the right tomb or take them to the right tomb, but they made up a lie about the disciples stealing the body, right? They said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. So this one doesn't really hold much water anymore either, and I haven't heard it too much. I feel like this has been pretty well debunked, but some people still will claim it. So it's good to kind of touch on it. Another one that has been largely debunked is the swoon theory. So this is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die, but was merely unconscious, and he was later revived, like he came to in the tomb. So there was a wonderful article in the Journal of American Medical Association written by Dr. William D. Edwards, and he did a comprehensive review of the physiological and anatomical impacts of crucifixion and argued conclusively for the death of Jesus, not mere unconsciousness. So he went off the details available in the Bible. Specifically, he went through what likely happened based on the descriptions in Mark 15, Matthew 27, Luke 23, and John 19, as well as what we know today from a medical standpoint, what happens when a body is subjected to trauma. So Dr. Edwards states that the beginning of the end for Jesus actually started in the Garden of Gethsemane when he underwent extreme psychological and emotional turmoil as a result of his impending crucifixion, right? When he was praying for the cup to be removed from him, we're told that Jesus began to sweat blood in Luke 22. And this was specifically noted in the Gospels. So this is a condition called hematidrosis, which is an actual medical diagnosis that has been known to happen in contemporary times. It's not common, but it does happen. And so when a person is under extreme duress, the capillaries around their sweat glands can break and cause the blood to intermingle with the sweat. And so it actually appears that they are sweating blood. So, and this was documented, right? That they saw this happen. So we know that he was under extreme psychological stress in the garden. So then we can progress to the severe beating that Jesus underwent at the hands of the Romans. And that caused an extreme amount of physical trauma to his body, that then he would have lost a lot of blood during this. And the theory is that he would have gone into hypovolemic shock, which is what happens when you lose a lot of blood and the blood volume becomes too low. So your heart has to beat a lot faster. You have to breathe much more quickly to get oxygen into the cells. As a result of the blood loss, they start to become anemic, right? Because they don't have enough of the red blood cells to carry their oxygen. So they're starting to breathe really fast. And that changes the acid-base balance, which in turn has other negative consequences that can hasten the person's death. And so that's part of what happens in shock. We also have the loss of blood causing a drop in Jesus's blood pressure. So we can see instances of him fainting. And again, it's documented that when he's carrying the cross up the hill, he can't carry it anymore. He falls to the ground. And so somebody else is assigned to carry it for him, right? So we know how traumatic that beating was, and just the level of detail that we see of what happened and what we know about it is, I mean, terrible. If you've never researched, what that beating actually would have looked like, you may or may not want to. It brings a whole nother level of the torture that Jesus underwent for us. But we can very safely say, based off of how the Romans did the beatings back then, we can very safely say that there was a lot of trauma to Jesus's body prior to being crucified. And so when we see this hypovolemic shock from the blood loss, from the trauma, from the beating, we know from current medical understanding of how the body works that it would have caused his heart to have to work much, much harder than it normally would have. So this fast heartbeat can contribute to all kinds of heart issues and ultimately end in heart failures. And this can happen fairly quickly, right, when we're under a huge trauma. So then we have two other symptoms that can arise as a result. We have something called pleural effusion, which is when water or fluid collects around the lungs and is a known result of trauma, and also can happen from hypovolemic shock as well. And then we also have what's called pericardial effusion, which is where blood and other fluid can collect around the heart, the sac that covers the heart, and squeezes it to the point where it can no longer beat. And so essentially it squeezes the heart to death until the pressure is so great it can no longer pump blood. And so again, this can be caused by trauma. So the physical trauma that he underwent prior to the crucifixion would very much have hastened his death, which is one of the reasons why he might have died within a couple of hours, 6 hours, rather than multiple days. So typically a crucifixion would last a couple of days, and they would actually break the bones of the crucified in the leg bones so they could no longer push themselves up. And that pushing up action was necessary for them to be able to take a breath in. And so when their leg bones were broken, they were no longer able to use their legs to push themselves up. And then they would die of asphyxiation very quickly after that. But they would allow them to hang on the cross for, a couple of days before they would actually do that. So we didn't see that happen with Jesus, right? Which was a fulfillment actually of prophecy that no bones of his were broken. So that was actually a fairly uncommon thing to not have to break their bones to cause the death. And then the last piece of evidence that is cited by Dr. Edwards is the observation in John 19, verse 34, that says, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." So this is where Dr. Edwards was able to understand that there was pleural effusion and a pericardial effusion that occurred. And so based on the description, all of the evidence that was documented in the Gospels and what would likely have happened as a result of the traumatic beating prior to the crucifixion, and they calculated based off of, height and angles and all of that, where the heart would or where the spear would have pierced. And the conclusion was that it would have likely been on the right side in an upward trajectory based on where Jesus would have been hanging. That would have pierced both the lung and the heart, which explains the water and the blood that both came out. So in Dr. Edwards' conclusion in this article, he states that clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and suggests that the spear thrust between his ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, the interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So by having a medical doctor take a look at all this, he essentially is saying there's no way that a man could have lived through this. But Dr. Edwards pretty conclusively showed that Jesus did actually die. We can also, though, look at the impracticality of recovery and escape from the tomb. So if the medical argument isn't enough, we have to think about where Jesus was, right? He was laid in a tomb, and the way that the tomb was is that it's essentially a hole carved into the side of a hill, and then they would seal it with a very, very heavy stone seal, like a huge stone rock. So it would, and now think about how badly Jesus was beaten, and then he hung on a cross and was crucified for 6 hours. He hung there, right? And then he had a spear thrust into his side. And so he had a deep penetrating spear wound. Okay, so he wouldn't have been able to, like, he had pierced feet. So how is he going to walk out of the tomb on feet that were pierced? It doesn't even make sense. And then there were guards posted that precludes any escape, if you want to call it that. There's no way that anybody would have been able to help Jesus get out unless the guards were in on it, right? And we know that that's not what happened based on the stories in the gospel. So the theory that he was either removed or walked out on his own doesn't stand up, right? Because we have the guards there. They didn't say, "Hey, the disciples stole the body." Like, that's not what they said. They said that the tomb is empty. We don't know where the body is. So, none of that matches or makes any kind of sense. So essentially the swoon theory is no longer accepted as a viable objection. And we have a lot of the medical evidence to back that up. So that one's kind of been put to sleep. So then that brings us to kind of the idea that the disciples may have stolen the body. And this is the one that has the most potential for being correct. It states that the disciples stole Jesus' body and made it appear that he had risen, essentially calling the rest of the resurrection story a lie that was perpetuated by the disciples. So that's kind of what this myth says, or this objection says. So there's a few basic things that we can look at. We can look at the fact that there were guards put there by the Sanhedrin, and if the disciples had actually stolen the body, they're going to come and report that, right? So there are a lot of logistics involved in trying to sneak a body out of a tomb that is guarded by guards. So there's the logistics of trying to get the rock away from the entrance, because this is, a 1-ton rock. And then there's the argument that if they did potentially steal the body before the burial actually occurred. So there was a short period of time from when they took him down from the cross on Friday night and then into early Saturday morning before the Romans or the guards would have been placed, that potentially the disciples could have secreted him away and then closed the tomb up before the soldiers came to seal the tomb. That actually is probably the strongest argument available against Jesus's resurrection. But if we think about this, if the Gospels were written to rebut this argument, they did a really bad job of it. If the disciples had actually stolen the body within that time period, when they wrote the Gospel at a later time, would they have written it the way that they did? Because there's a lot of ambiguity, right? They didn't make it crystal clear. They didn't account for every minute of what happened with the body, which we would expect if they really did steal the body. We would expect to see that they've covered every angle, every aspect, so there could be no doubt, right? We're not going to leave open this potential door if they are writing it to cover up the fact that they stole the body during this time period. And so William Lane Craig wrote about this well. And he said that he could see the gospel being written in a way where the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders all go to Pilate, ask for the guard, and then they all go together. They all see Jesus being put into the tomb and rolling the stone across it, right, and sealing it and then keeping watch. And then Sunday morning, Jesus himself is seen coming out of the tomb with two angels. Maybe there was a crowd of people around that were, followers of him, and they had seen his crucifixion and they wanted to come worship or, lay down memorabilia or flowers or whatever at the tomb. I don't think they did that back then, but they would have had witnesses actually see Jesus coming out of the tomb, and beyond a shadow of a doubt, there was eyewitnesses to the fact that they saw him walk out of the tomb and he was whole and he was healthy again. And there were people there that actually witnessed it. They would have written it in that way, right? Where there's no doubt about what happened. And yet that's not what we see happened, right? We see that there's some question, there's some room for debate, there's some wiggle room in interpretation, and nothing is concrete and absolute. And so that is good evidence in and of itself that the gospel was not written by people who were trying to cover their tracks that they had stolen the body. And so we have to look at how the mindset of someone who is perpetrating a lie, how would they have written this story to validate, the resurrection? That's how you would have to think about it if they did actually steal it. And that's not what we see happens, right? And so that gives a lot of credence to the fact that the way that this is written is how it actually happened. And then, of course, there's also the women used as witnesses, right? So again, if we're looking at a made-up story, if the Gospels had made this up or, something different had happened, they wouldn't have used women as first witnesses. So this is an embarrassing fact, as I mentioned in the last episode, that women were not considered able to hold testimony because their word was not reliable. So nobody would ever use women as the witnesses to the empty tomb if they were making something up. Like they would have had one of the disciples go and look, right? And then to admit that the disciples fled during the crucifixion and, hiding when the tomb was found to be empty. Like those are embarrassing facts too, right? You're not going to write about yourself as doing these things if it wasn't actually historically true. Like, no one's going to want to put that information in there because it kind of makes the disciples look bad, right? They followed this man for 3 years and they believed that he was God, and yet then they fled and they hid and protected themselves. Like that's not, we see what happens when the Holy Spirit comes down and indwells in them, right? And gives them that courage. Remembering what we talked about last episode as well, that not one disciple recanted, even under torture and death, right? Like they all stuck to what happened and the fact that they saw the risen Jesus. The empty tomb was real, he was bodily resurrected. So some of these are really intense things to think about. I mean, we're so trained in science-minded thinking, right? That it becomes hard for us to wrap our brains around, like logically wrap our brains around that this was actual history. Like Jesus actually died. He was a real person. He died and then he rose. Like that took me a long time to wrap my head around even as a Christian, because when you, especially I think if you grow up hearing these stories, they remain that somewhat childhood story that's in your head. But when you really get down into the history and the evidence, like this is a true living, breathing person who was crucified and then he rose from the dead. Like this is amazing to me. And this was something that I struggled with for a very long time to wrap my logical brain around because we don't want to think that something like this is possible because we don't see it. Like we've never seen this before, except for maybe back then when Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, right? Like it's the only time in history that it's ever happened. And so, yeah, it's really hard to believe. And, if you struggle with believing that, let me know. Like put a comment in below because this is so like this is foundational. This is key, right? We have to come to terms with the truth of this historical event because it's everything. It's everything. So I want to ask you a question or two just to kind of think about the impact that this can have on you when you really sit and just chew on it, just think on it, ponder it, meditate on it, right? What difference does the resurrection make in your everyday life, in your levels of stress or anxiety, in all of the things that you have to do? Right? What does it mean for you if Jesus came back from the dead? How are you going to change your spiritual life if you truly, viscerally understand the importance that Christ truly conquered death and he came back? Like, how does that change how we approach our relationship with God? And this comes back to our health. This comes back to the way that we prioritize our day, what we hold important in this life, right? And that was something that I've seen shift for myself over the last couple of years as I really truly viscerally understand what the implication of the resurrection here. I started to see how the things that I was focusing on were things of this world, not things of the world to come, right? That I truly understand now we're visitors on this planet, on earth, right? This is our temporary dwelling, but our home is in heaven with Jesus. And when we start to understand the vastness of him coming down and then resurrecting, like that just changes the priority. Like heaven becomes real. It's not just some thought of some place that we might sometime get to after we no, like it's real and it's here and that's where we belong. And so how are we making that our priority over the things that we have here? Now, that doesn't mean that we neglect our family, that we neglect our responsibilities, we don't pay the bills, or we neglect finances. That's not what it means, because we are called to be stewards of the gifts that we've been given here on earth. But is that our end all be all? Is that what we're solely focusing on? Are we always prioritizing everything else over our relationship with God? And that's really where it comes down to, how does my day reflect my commitment to the Lord? And if it does, and you're focused in on him, and you start your day with him, and you end your day with him, and you're talking to him through the day, and he's involved in every aspect, amazing. Like, keep up the good work. And also let me know how you do that, because I am still working towards that. I think that's a goal that we all do, right? It's what it means to become more Christ-like, is to really be able to prioritize God and things that are unseen over our earthly lives and the pull that our physical presence has. So But if you haven't talked to God for a while, or if you only talk to him in church, or if you don't ever open the Bible and read it for yourself, what are the things that you're prioritizing over that time with the Lord? And why are those the priorities? Because if there is something that is blocking you from feeling that intense desire to get to know the Lord more and to delve into that relationship, we need to explore that, right? Is that anger at him for something that's happened? Is that a disbelief in that this is truly a real thing that happened? Is it like it was in my mind for so long? Is it that you have just kept this childlike understanding of the stories and it's not really real to you? Because that's how it was to me pretty much my whole life. Like I'd never sat down to really look at this from a living, breathing human being who died and then rose again. And so that became very real for me when I realized like that was a big block. It was my ability to understand that these were true events and not just some story that I had learned as a child. And so I just invite you to just think about that. Like, if you're not prioritizing time with God in your day, why not? What's blocking you? And how do we move past that? Because I know that your true desire, like if you're listening to this, your true desire is to get to know the Lord. Because the resurrection means like our sins are truly forgiven. It's not a symbolic thing. It's not just hope that we have, but it's actually a literal physical thing that is happening, right? When Jesus walked out of the tomb, that was God's public declaration that he he accepted the sacrifice, right? The debt was canceled, and now we get to live with Jesus forever. We have eternity. Death is no longer our master, and that we're never alone, right? We're never fighting alone. Whatever we're carrying, our anxiety, our chronic stress, our marital strain, parenting exhaustion, doubt, shame, guilt, whatever it is, the resurrection means that Jesus comes to us through the Holy Spirit and gives us strength and power, right? Ephesians 1 says the same power that raised Jesus from the dead now works in you. This isn't symbolic or metaphorical. This is actual resurrection power for real life healing and transformation. We just have to take that and we have to put it to work, right? We have to allow it a chance to work in our hearts and in our lives. So I hope that this series was really helpful for you in giving you a little bit more teeth to your argument, and or even personally helping you to understand a little bit more about the reality of the resurrection as it did for me. Like that was a first step. And then secondly, it was learning how to be able to how to defend that logical, rational understanding of the events around the resurrection and how true it is. So we are going to be going on a series break or a season break. Season 3 will be coming in January. So for December, I wish you all a Merry Christmas. And I pray that you have wonderful times with your family, that there is no stress, that you remember it's not about the presents, it's not about the food, it's about our loving Savior who was born and given to us as a gift. And encourage you to really focus in even just a little piece of the holiday celebrations, of the Christmas celebrations, that there would be time to dedicate to talking about the birth of Jesus with your kids, with your family. This is a perfect opportunity to be able to share the gospel with any unsaved loved ones. Just in a way, especially if you're hosting, to be able to read something about the birth and the death, right? The gospel, taking advantage, not just sharing the birth of Christ, but sharing the gospel message and what his birth signifies for us. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to have an excuse to share the gospel, right? Because if we're celebrating Christmas, then we get to celebrate Christ. So I pray that you have a wonderful month, and I will see you again in January.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please subscribe for more topics like this, where we focus on bringing our faith and health together for a whole you. If you have questions around your health or your faith, including doubts and struggles with what you've been taught about God, we'd love to have you send us an email at support@psalmmedical.com.